We're picking up soon after Henry VIII dumped his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Wife number 3, Jane Seymour, died after giving birth to his only legitimate son, Edward VI, who's also shown here. I should note that Henry VIII is usually listed as one of the new monarchs. He certainly centralized power and asserted control over the church. So here's the first of our video clips. Henry VIII's only legitimate son reinstated strict Protestantism, as you just saw, but he only lived 6 years before dying as a teenager. Edward VI was succeeded by his older sister Mary, a daughter of Catherine Aragon, a fervent Catholic. Before you watch a short video clip about her reign, keep this question in mind. In what ways did Mary Tudor follow Machiavelli's advice? And in what ways did she ignore his advice? Okay, now that you've watched the video clip, let's return to the question. What would Machiavelli think? Remember that Machiavelli advised princes to be feared but not hated. He also said that nothing inspired hatred like taking away property. So notice, Mary restored the church, but she did not attempt to restore the church's property, all those monasteries, etc., that had been snapped up by favorites of the king. So people who gained church loot under Henry VIII got to keep it. What advice from Machiavelli did she ignore? Well, she was certainly feared. She was known as Bloody Mary, but her executions did not appear to be just, and thus she was not only feared but hated. Notice, too, that the English are becoming more patriotic, more conscious of being English. Dynastic marriages, the idea that an English queen would marry a Spanish king, had been nothing new, but now they were simply becoming less acceptable. And this rising patriotism was also part of the new monarchies. The smartest new monarchs took advantage of this growing pride in being English or French or Spanish or Russian. It became part of being loved. So stay tuned for Elizabeth I and Louis XIV. And now we arrive at Queen Elizabeth I. She was arguably the most important and most successful of the so-called new monarchs. In her speeches and writings, she referred to herself as a prince. And in your short essay, you're going to look at whether or when she followed Machiavelli's advice in The Prince. Be careful. I've just talked about her big sister, Bloody Mary, but the question asks about Elizabeth. You're also going to answer this question with regard to Louis XIV. He's not actually as often classed as a quote-unquote new monarch. His predecessor, Henry IV, is. By the time Louis XIV comes into power, we're looking another century beyond this. We're looking at full-fledged absolutist monarchies. At any rate, there is a lively debate, interestingly enough, about whether or not Elizabeth I ever actually read Machiavelli's The Prince. We know Cromwell read it, and it's widely thought that Henry VIII read Machiavelli's Prince as well. We know that Elizabeth spoke and read Italian, and there is at least one copy of The Prince, now in the library at Princeton University, that suggests it might have been Elizabeth's. Whether or not she read it, Elizabeth would have been familiar with Machiavelli's descriptions of a wise prince, because he was all the rage among educated Europeans. So as you watch a couple of video clips about Elizabeth I, think about these questions. How did she set out to be feared? How did she set out to be loved? How did she try to avoid being hated, even if she was feared? Remember again that Machiavelli tells his prince not to encourage hatred. Don't steal property, don't steal women, make sure your executions at least seem to be fair. And finally, remember that Machiavelli's prince needed to demonstrate courage as well as cruelty, and really needed to win wars as well. You have a separate note page for this essay. Use it. So this first clip describes the early years of Elizabeth's reign. This clip takes us to the middle of Elizabeth's reign and to her fight against Catholic Spain and a rival claimant to the throne, her Catholic cousin Mary, the Queen of Scotland. The clip finishes as Spain is about to invade England with its great armada. I'm switching videos for the actual speech to the troops. This one's a little more dramatic, from the movie starring Cate Blanchett. Here's an edited version of the speech that you just saw Elizabeth giving to the troops before the Armada. By the way, the English Navy defeated the Armada, a very dramatic naval battle, and it was the turning point in history and really represented the rise of England and also greatly increased Elizabeth's popularity with English people. But let's return to this speech. This is a text, again, of the speech you just saw. It's in your notes as well. So, what Machiavellian elements do you see in this speech? Remember that this is good support that you could use in your essay for the points you want to make about whether or not Machiavelli would have approved, essentially, of Elizabeth's actions or whether she went against his advice. So, what do you see that he would approve? What ways is she ignoring Machiavelli's advice? We know from her actions against Catholic priests and her own relative and fellow queen, Mary Queen of Scots, that Elizabeth was quite willing to instill fear and to be cruel. Although, notice she also went out of her way to try to make the executions appear just, especially the execution of Queen Mary. But this speech, and the next one you'll see, is really all about love. I don't think Elizabeth believed that a prince had to choose between being feared and loved. She went for both. She also, note, went out of her way to demonstrate her courage and her willingness to fight wars. Okay, we're going to skip a lot of history now. The later days of Elizabeth's reign were more difficult for her. England experienced some hard economic times. She was caught up in long wars with Spain and with Holland and with the Irish. Also, her economic policies were coming under a lot of criticism, especially her policy of selling monopolies. Basically, merchants would pay the crown, the queen, a huge amount of money to get the right to be the only people who sold certain goods, because they were the only people they could sell at a high price and make a lot of money, which, as you might expect, made others angry. Now, this money was needed for the wars against Spain, Holland, and the Irish, and Elizabeth did not want to have to go to Parliament and ask for money. But her actions and these monopolies were widely criticized. Interestingly, Elizabeth, and this is just 2 years before she dies, at the end of her reign, she's 68 years old, she chose to accept some of this criticism and to back down, at least in part, in her support for the monopoly. So, rather than simply assert her power, she called members of Parliament to the Queen's presence chamber and gave what came to be known as the Golden Speech. It's mostly about the character and duty of princes, but you might note that by explaining herself to England's legislature, Elizabeth is also taking a step toward constitutionalism. There will be a lot more steps backward as well as forward until we get there. Meanwhile, you're going to watch one last video clip about Elizabeth I. Lots of actresses have played Elizabeth. Glenda Jackson is actually my favorite, but I may be showing my age. Elizabeth R. was a BBC special back in the 1970s, I believe it was. Okay, you have the speech in your notes as well. So what do you think? Was Elizabeth a follower of Machiavelli? Well, note that she makes it very clear up front that she is not personally benefiting from the monopolies. I am not greedy, she says. Remember that advice Machiavelli gave about not taking property? Once again, she offers and asks for love. This really isn't a speech about fear. Elizabeth emphasizes her success as a leader of a militarily dominant country. Note that this is a little tricky since she was a woman and did not actually fight, but the English people saw her as a warrior queen, and her famous speech to the troops had a lot to do with that. Machiavelli may not have understood just how powerful a force national patriotism would become. Remember that he wrote for princes in Italian city-states. But Elizabeth understood the power of patriotism very well. It's going to be a powerful force for the rest of this course. In my next lecture, I'll move on to the English Civil War and the birth of a genuine constitutional monarchy.